did you kill a man in a fist fight?
Well, we was fighting one another, and we was kicking one another, and his head hit the concrete, and it must have been a pretty bad blow, which I've suffered deep contrition for since it happened. But nevertheless, I was instrumental in the fatality of a fellow human being whom happened to be one of my personal friends. Unfortunately for me, they found out that I was Don King, the guy that was running the numbers. Now the sensationalism came into play. Don King, the numbers baron, the numbers czar, the numbers kingpin. So they began to try me for numbers rather than for an accidental death and the fatality of a fellow human being.
April 20th, 1966. Cleveland, Ohio. Cedar Avenue. A man is on the concrete, face up, head bleeding. Another man is standing over him, kicking him. The guy on the ground, he's not fighting back anymore. He's trying to say something. Witnesses said it was this: "Don, I'll pay you the money." That was it. That was the sentence. 4 days later, he died in a hospital bed. He was 34 years old. His name was Sam Garrett. He owed $600. Hold on to that number. $600. We're going to come back to it. Hey, so I need to talk to you about a case that has been honestly messing with me for weeks now. Because the guy who did that to Sam Garrett on a Cleveland sidewalk, you've seen his face. Probably 100 times. The electric hair standing up. The American flag suits. The only in America grin. He's 94 years old right now. Still alive. Still promoting. Never spent a full 5 years in prison for anything. Got pardoned by Coretta Scott King. Made about $100 million before the end of the 70s. And you want to know the part that really got me? He changed U.S. law twice without meaning to. 2 different times. And I'll prove it before we're done here. So let me tell you about Don King. Okay, so before I get to Don, I need to stay with Sam for a second. Because in every story you've ever seen about Don King, Sam Garrett is a footnote. He's a sentence. He's a man Don King killed. That's it. And I hate that because he was a person. Sam Garrett was 34 years old in the spring of 1966. He worked for Don as a numbers runner in Cleveland's East Side, which means his job was to walk around black neighborhoods and collect bets for the illegal lottery Don was running out of the basement of a record store. He was sickly. He was struggling with addiction. He was one of the guys at the bottom of the pyramid that Don sat on top of. And I want you to understand what Cleveland was in 1966. This is before the Fair Housing Act. This is a city where black families had been redlined out of every legitimate path to wealth for decades. The numbers game wasn't glamorous. It was what existed when nothing else was allowed to. And Sam Garrett was one of the men doing the walking on Wednesday, April 20th, 1966. He walked into a place called the Manhattan Tap Room at the corner of Cedar Avenue and East 100th Street. He owed his boss money. Don showed up. And whatever was said inside that bar, it ended with the two of them out on the sidewalk. Here's what the arresting officer, Bob Tone, testified to under oath. Don was 6'4", 250. Sam was sick, maybe 140. Don had a revolver. He pistol whipped Sam with it. Then he kicked him in the head multiple times on a public sidewalk in broad daylight in front of witnesses. 2 Cleveland detectives had to physically pull him off. Sam Garrett never regained consciousness. He died on April 24th. Severe head trauma from blunt force against concrete. The medical examiner's words, not mine. And I just want to say something really quick here. We don't know who Sam Garrett wanted to be. We don't know what he dreamed about when he was a kid. We don't know who he loved. Nobody wrote a book about Sam Garrett. Nobody made a documentary. He died on a Cleveland sidewalk with a sentence in his mouth about a $600 debt, and he disappeared from history. while the man who killed him became one of the most famous faces in American sports. That asymmetry is what this whole video is about. Just sit with that for a second before we keep going. Here's what happened at trial. A jury, 8 women, 4 men, deliberated for 4 hours. 4 hours. They came back with second-degree murder. That's life in prison territory. And then something strange happened. Don's lawyer met with the judge privately. No prosecutor in the room. And when they came out, the charge had been quietly reduced to voluntary manslaughter. Don served 3 years and 11 months. Less than 4 years for stomping a sickly man to death in front of 2 cops and a bar full of witnesses. Hold that in your head. That's the baseline. We're going to build on it. Okay, so now I want to show you the other side. Because running parallel to Sam Garrett's life was another life that started in the same ghetto, same era, same city, and took a very different shape. Donald King was born August 20th, 1931, 5th of 6 kids. His dad, Clarence, worked at the Otis Steel plant. In Cleveland, dangerous work, no safety protections for black industrial workers, no legal recourse when something went wrong. And on December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor Day, a ladle of molten steel exploded at the plant, and Clarence King was killed instantly. Don was 10 years old. The company paid the family $10,000 for his dad's life. That's a little over $200,000 in today's money. For a father of 6, that was the settlement. His mom, Hattie, took the money, moved the family to a slightly better neighborhood, and did what women in pre-civil rights Cleveland did when the legal economy offered them nothing. She ran a concession stand that was really a front for a numbers operation, and Don and his brothers learned to count cash before they fully understood addition. That's the world he came up in. And I'm not excusing anything here. I want to be clear. I'm just saying the same conditions that produced Sam Garrett produced Don King. One of them became the bottom of the pyramid. The other became the top. And what separated them wasn't virtue. It wasn't even luck. It was a willingness to do things the other one wouldn't. By his early 20s, Don was running gambling operations across Cleveland's east side. They called him the Kid, also Cadillac Slim. And in December of 1954, 12 years before Sam Garrett, Don killed someone else. A guy named Hillary Brown tried to rob one of Don's gambling houses. Don shot him in the back as he was running away. Ruled justifiable homicide. No charges, no prison, no consequences. So by 1966, when Don walked into the Manhattan tap room, this was his second body, not his first. And here's where the story does something I genuinely did not see coming when I started researching this, because between those 2 killings, something else happened. Something I need you to hear. Stay with me here. This is the part that stopped me cold. May of 1957. Someone throws a bomb at Don King's front porch in Cleveland. Rival gambling people. The porch goes up. Don survives. Cleveland police start hunting for the guy they think did it. A suspect named Virgil Ogletree. Somebody gives them a tip. On May 23rd, 1957, 3 Cleveland cops show up at a duplex on the east side of town. They think Ogletree is hiding inside. They don't have a warrant. The woman who lives there, her name is Dollree Mapp, calls her lawyer and says, "Don't let them in." The cops wait. 3 hours later, they come back with more officers. They break the door. They cuff her. They search the place. They don't find Ogletree, but they find some material that was illegal in Ohio at the time. They charge her with it. She gets convicted, and she appeals, and she keeps appealing. And on June 19th, 1961, 4 years before Don ever kills Sam Garrett, that case lands at the Supreme Court of the United States. It's called Mapp versus Ohio. And the court rules 6-3 in her favor. And in ruling for her, they create what we now call the exclusionary rule. If you have ever watched a police show, any police show, and heard a lawyer say that evidence is inadmissible, they didn't have a warrant, that's Mapp versus Ohio. That's the Fourth Amendment protection that applies to every American in every state. The reason police need a warrant to search your home, the reason illegally obtained evidence can be thrown out, all of it, comes from that case. And that case exists because somebody firebombed Don King's porch. I'm serious. Go look it up. This is not a conspiracy thing. The ACLU documents it. The Cornell Law School case file mentions it. Britannica mentions it. A Cleveland numbers runner who would go on to stomp a man to death over $600 accidentally triggered one of the most important constitutional rulings of the 20th century. And this is only the first time Don King changed American law. The second time is on purpose. And we'll get there. But I wanted you to sit with that one for a second. Because the guy who America turned into a celebrity, his life was already rewriting the country's legal framework before he ever walked into boxing. 1971. Don walks out of Marion Correctional Institution after 3 years and 11 months. He's 39 years old. He has a manslaughter conviction on his record. He has no money, no connections in legitimate sports, and no boxing experience at all. In prison, he had done one thing that mattered. He'd gone to the library and read everything he could find. Shakespeare, Nietzsche, philosophy, not because he loved literature, because he'd figured out that if you can quote Shakespeare at will, white people in suits will let you into rooms they wouldn't otherwise. That's the tool he built in prison. And he used it the day he got out. A year later, 1972, he convinced Muhammad Ali, the most famous athlete alive, to come to Cleveland and fight an exhibition for a struggling black-owned hospital. The event grossed over $80,000. The hospital, according to multiple accounts, received about 1,500, maybe 2,500, depending on the source. That was Don King's first professional move in boxing. A charity event where the charity got the scraps. And nobody stopped him then. Nobody ever really stopped him. That pattern, big play, quiet, allegation, keep moving is the whole playbook. It will repeat for the next 50 years with almost no interruption. Okay, so 1974, 2 years after the hospital thing, Don pulls off something that genuinely should not have worked. Because he gets the two most dominant heavyweight boxers on the planet, Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, to sign contracts to fight each other, he promises each of them $5 million, record money at the time, $10 million total. There's just one problem. He doesn't have the $10 million. He doesn't have anything close to it. What he has is a pitch. And the willingness to take that pitch to anybody with money, regardless of how they got it, he ends up in Zaire, Central Africa, talking to a dictator named Mobutu Sese Seko, who had systematically looted his own country's treasury to build a personal fortune. Don's pitch. Host this fight, the whole world will see Zaire as a serious country. Mobutu agrees. He puts up $10 million from public money extracted from one of the poorest populations on Earth to pay 2 American boxers. October 30th, 1974. Ali knocks out Foreman in the 8th round. The event is watched by an estimated 1 billion people worldwide. It generates roughly $100 million in revenue. That's over $700 million in today's money. 3 years earlier, Don King had been in a prison cell in Marion, Ohio. Now he just produced the most financially significant boxing event in history. A year later, he does it again with the Thrilla in Manila, Ali versus Joe Frazier, third and final fight in their rivalry. By 1976, he has contracts with almost every top heavyweight in the world. And now, here's where the math gets ugly. I want you to actually hear these numbers because they tell you exactly how this machine worked. Larry Holmes, heavyweight champion for 7 years, one of the best fighters of the era. Over the course of his career, he says Don King cheated him out of about $10 million. Here's how. Holmes fights Ken Norton for a purse of $500,000. He receives $150,000. Fights Ernie Shavers for a purse of $200,000. Receives $50,000. Every fight, the same story. The contracted number on paper, the much smaller number in the account. Don calls it consulting fees, calls it finder's fees, calls it a hidden management cut. Holmes eventually sues, settles for $150,000 on a claim of millions, and he has to sign a gag order. He can't talk about it publicly anymore. That's the deal. You want any money back, you trade your right to speak. Holmes takes it. He's got medical bills. He's got a family. He takes it. And the man has still said on camera that Don King gave him his career. Both things are true. That's the trap. Now let me tell you about Tim Witherspoon, because Witherspoon is the case that breaks your heart if you let it. Tim was a heavyweight from Philadelphia. Born 1957, he won the WBA heavyweight title in January of 1986, and his first title defense was in London that July against a British challenger named Frank Bruno. 40,000 people packed Wembley Stadium. Biggest boxing crowd in UK history to that point. HBO paid Don King $1.7 million for the fight. Witherspoon won in the 11th round. He's the champion. He's defending the belt on enemy soil in front of a hostile crowd, and he pulls it off. So, what did the champion take home? $90,000. Some accounts say $115,000. Either way, a fraction of what was supposed to go to him. Frank Bruno, the guy he beat, took home about $900,000. The loser, 10 times the champion's paycheck. How does that math work? It works because Don's stepson, Carl, was Witherspoon's manager. Carl took 50% of Tim's purse, which, by the way, is illegal under Nevada boxing rules. Max is 33%. Don took promoter's cut. Then there were fees. Training camp fees at Don's own camp in Ohio, $150 a day. Billed to Tim, sparring partner fees, flights for Don's friends to come watch, per diem charges. Everything added up, subtracted from the top, until the champion got $90,000. And you know how Witherspoon signed those contracts in the first place? He signed 4 of them. Journalist Jack Newfield called them contracts of servitude in his 1995 book on King. Tim was told he couldn't have his own lawyer present. One of the contracts he signed was blank, just blank. Don's people could fill in whatever terms they wanted afterward. If Tim refused, he'd be blackballed. That was the word. Don controlled so much of the heavyweight division that if you didn't sign with him, you couldn't get a title fight, period. Don himself, in interviews, admitted to a version of this. I might have stole half, he said in one interview about Mike Tyson. But would you rather have half of 20 or all of 5? That's the pitch. That's the trap. That's the whole business model, reduced to one sentence. Tim Witherspoon eventually sued Don for $25 million, settled for $1 million. He fought professionally until he was in his 40s trying to make it back. He never did. Okay, I need to stop here for a second because I want to be honest with you about something. When I was reading through all of this, the Holmes stuff, the Witherspoon stuff, there's a moment where your brain starts to adjust. You start thinking, oh, this is just how boxing worked in the 80s. Rough business. Everybody took a cut. Shake it off. And then you hit the next thing. And it's not just a cut anymore. It's a man in a hospital bill. October 2nd, 1980. Muhammad Ali fights Larry Holmes for the heavyweight title. He's 38 years old. He's past his prime. He probably shouldn't be in the ring at all. Doctors had already raised concerns about brain damage, but the money is too good to refuse. $8 million guaranteed. Promoted by, you know who. Holmes beats him badly. Ali is done. He leaves the ring concussed, visibly shaken, showing the early signs of what we now know was the onset of Parkinson's disease. And when Ali goes through his accounting, afterward, he realizes he's been underpaid by about $1.1 million. So in 1982, he sues Don King. And here's what Don does next. I'm going to tell you this plainly and let you react. However you react, Don calls a man named Jeremiah Shabazz. Shabazz was a Nation of Islam minister in Philadelphia, one of Ali's closest advisors for years. Don hands him a suitcase. Inside the suitcase is $50,000 in cash and a letter. The letter says that Ali is ending his lawsuit against Don King and accepting the $50,000 as final payment. The letter also gives Don exclusive rights to promote any future Ali fight, should Ali ever fight again. Don asks Shabazz to go to the hospital, where Ali was failing health, early stage Parkinson's, and get him to sign the letter and then hand him the $50,000. Shabazz goes. Ali signs. Shabazz's own words later, Ali was ailing by then and mumbling a lot. I guess he needed the money. That's one sentence. Read it again. Ailing and mumbling a lot. I guess he needed the money. Jeremiah Shabazz later said he regretted it for the rest of his life. He died in 1998, still carrying that regret. And Ali's own lawyer, who had been building the case for months and didn't know anything about this, found out afterward that the lawsuit had been quietly killed. The lawyer cried. That's in the record. He cried when he heard, because the greatest athlete America ever produced had just signed away his own legal rights and his future image rights from a hospital bed for $50,000 in a suitcase while he was too ill to fully understand what he was signing. And the man who made that happen didn't face a single consequence for it. You guys, I need a second, okay? Because the story I just told you about Ali, that's not even the worst of it. That's the famous one. The one people know. The one there's actually a decent paper trail on. There's another fighter named Meldrick Taylor who was told he could take $300,000 of a $1.3 million purse, or he could refuse, and something bad would happen to him. That allegation ended up in a federal court filing, not on a podcast. There's a fighter named Terry Norris who sued and settled for $7.5 million in 2003 and insisted the settlement be made public because he knew that's how these things got buried. And then there's Tyson, which I have to talk about Tyson, but I need you to understand the context first. Mike Tyson was 20 years old when he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history in 1986. He was raised in Brownsville, Brooklyn. Grew up poor, grew up angry. His trainer, Cus D'Amato, was basically a father figure. Cus dies in 85. Tyson's manager, Jim Jacobs, also basically a father figure, dies in 88. And suddenly this 22-year-old kid is the most marketable human being in American sports. And he has nobody he trusts. Don King goes to Jim Jacobs's funeral. Despite having almost no relationship with the guy, he carries the casket. He positions himself as the new father figure, starts calling Tyson my black brother, gets Mike into clubs, concerts, around rappers and celebrities, makes sure there are cameras. And Tyson, who had never had someone stay, lets him in. And for about a decade, it worked. They made hundreds of millions of dollars together. Tyson was the biggest draw in sports. And then Tyson started reading his own accounting. And the numbers weren't adding up. He was being charged $8,000 a week for towels. That's not a joke. That's a real line item. He was being charged for Don's family members' salaries. Christmas bonuses for Don's employees were being billed to Tyson. He had signed his likeness rights away years ago and didn't remember doing it 30% of any outside appearance money going to Don automatically. In 1998, Mike Tyson sued Don King for $100 million. And here's what Tyson said about King in one documented interview, which I'll clean up for you. But the words are real. He's a wretched, slimy reptilian. This is supposed to be my brother, my black brother. He's just a bad man. He would kill his mother for $1. He's ruthless. He's deplorable. He doesn't know how to love anybody. Those last 4 words, supposed to be my brother. That is not a financial complaint. That's the language of someone describing not the loss of money, but the loss of the belief that somebody had been on his side. For a man whose whole identity was built on the concept of loyalty, in combat, that wound may have run deeper than anything in the accounting. The lawsuit settled in 2004. $14 million, small fraction of the $100 million Tyson had claimed. And here's the detail that I can't shake. Tyson didn't receive $1 of it, not $1. Every cent of that, $14 million, went to pay off creditors. Tyson owed $38 million at that point to the IRS, to his ex-wife, to lawyers, to everyone. So the settlement just partially cleared a hole that existed largely because of the fighter-promoter relationship in the first place. Tyson said later, and this is another real quote, he did more bad to black fighters than any white promoter ever in the history of boxing. That's the sentence that actually collapses the whole mythology. Because the armor Don King wore for 50 years was racial solidarity. We black people got to stick together. The white promoters will rob you. And Tyson is saying that language, the brother language, the black people together language, wasn't protecting fighters. It was the tool that lowered their defenses so they could be robbed more efficiently by someone who looked like them. That's why it hit harder, not in spite of the shared background, because of it. So by the late 90s, we have a clear picture. Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, Tim Witherspoon, Meldrick Taylor, Terry Norris, Mike Tyson. And this is just the short list. Every one of them alleging the same pattern of underpayment. Every one of them settling for fractions of their claims. Every one of them signing gag orders or confidentiality clauses afterward. The federal government starts paying attention. The FBI investigates him throughout the 80s. In 1992, Don King is called to testify before the U.S. Senate about organized crime ties in boxing, specifically about his relationship with John Gotti, head of the Gambino crime family. Don invokes the Fifth Amendment, refuses to answer, walks out. 1999, the FBI raids his offices and names him an unindicted co-conspirator in a rankings and bribes scandal at the International Boxing Federation. He's never charged. The whole thing goes quiet. Nothing sticks. And this is where we get to the second time Don King changed U.S. law. Because by 2000, Congress has had it. And here's what most videos don't tell you. On May 26th, 2000, President Bill Clinton signed a federal law called the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, Public Law 106-210. You can look it up right now. It's still on the books, and here's what it does. It makes those coercive contracts Tim Witherspoon signed illegal. It bans the kind of monopoly clause that forced challengers to sign with Don King if they wanted a title shot. It requires financial disclosure between promoters and boxers. It makes it illegal for a promoter and a manager to be in the same family because that was the Carl King loophole. Basically, every tactic, Don King built his empire on Congress, wrote a law specifically to outlaw every single one. And I want you to think about how rare this is. Congress does not write federal laws targeting individual figures in sports. It almost never happens. The last time the federal government had gotten this deep into boxing was 1960, when the Senate ran hearings on mob influence in the sport. To get a federal law passed with hearings, committees, House and Senate votes, a presidential signature, one man has to have distorted an entire industry for decades. And when I tell you the Ali Act was basically the anti-Don King act, here's the proof. Every other major boxing promoter in America supported the bill publicly. Bob Arum, of Top Rank Don's biggest rival for 30 years, supported it. Only one major promoter publicly opposed it. That was Don King, and he lost. Twice in one lifetime, he'd changed American law by accident and then on purpose. Mapp versus Ohio, the Ali Act. Both of them exist because of him. Both of them in opposite directions. One protects every American from unlawful search. The other was written to protect fighters from him. You cannot make this up. Okay, I want to step back for a second, because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This pattern, older man positions himself as the father figure, gets talented young people to sign contracts they don't understand, builds an empire on the difference between what they earn and what they're paid. This shows up in other industries, other countries, other decades. And the comparison tells you something about which kind of survivors get caught and which kind don't. Orlando, Florida. 1990s, a man named Lou Pearlman builds two of the biggest pop groups in American history, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC. He calls himself the sixth Backstreet Boy, Big Papa. He positions himself as the father these teenage boys never had. And here's the math. After 2 years of nonstop touring, the 5 members of Backstreet Boys had received $300,000 combined total, while Lou had personally made $10 million. NSYNC was getting $35 a day in per diem, while their records were moving millions of copies. Look at that math. Now look at Witherspoon. 90,000 to the champion. 900,000 to the loser. Same math, different industry, different decade, different color faces. Same exact math. Lou Pearlman also cheated. He also lied to teenagers about contracts. He also used the family language to lower defenses. The Backstreet Boys and NSYNC sued him in the late 90s and eventually bought out of their contracts for $64 million combined. But here's the difference. In 2006, federal investigators figured out that Pearlman had also been running a Ponzi scheme on the side, defrauding investors of over $300 million. Once that hit the federal radar, because the victims were now investors and banks, not just poor kids from Florida. He got 25 years in prison, died there in 2016. Pearlman and Don King did variations of the same thing to young talent. One of them died in a federal prison. The other one is 94 years old and free. The difference is not the crime. The difference is who the secondary victims were. Pearlman made the mistake of scamming people who had lawyers and political donations. Don King only scammed fighters. And fighters don't get federal attention. Tokyo, Japan. For 50 years, a man named Johnny Kitagawa ran the biggest talent agency in the country. 100+ male stars. He controlled which boys got on TV. Japanese networks needed his talent to maintain ratings. So when stories started circulating in the late 80s about abuse, nobody ran them. Nobody could afford to. The networks would lose their biggest acts. Kitagawa died in 2019. Never charged, never convicted. It took a BBC documentary in 2023, an outside broadcaster in another country, to finally crack the silence. 478 people eventually came forward. The agency changed its name, but Kitagawa himself was already dead and intouchable. What Don King and Kitagawa share is not the specific act. It's the infrastructure. Monopolistic control over an industry. Media, that depends on you for content. Everyone knows something is wrong. Nobody has the independent leverage to act on it. So the thing continues for decades until the power broker dies or the industry collapses around them. That's the pattern. So the question that keeps sitting with me is this: what decides whether justice actually lands? And I don't think it's the law. The laws existed the whole time. I think it's whether somebody outside the system, an outside prosecutor, a foreign broadcaster, a federal investigator, chasing something else happens to notice. And whether the victims have the kind of political weight to make the noticing stick. Fighters don't have that weight. Japanese boy band recruits didn't have that weight. Teenage singers from Florida barely did. That's the gap. That's where the bodies go. And I'm going to leave that there because I don't have a clean answer for it. And neither does anybody else. January 5th, 1983, Ohio Governor Jim Rhodes signs a pardon for Don King. Full pardon for the manslaughter for Sam Garrett. And here are some of the names on the letters of support sent to the governor on Don's behalf. Jesse Jackson, Coretta Scott King, the mayor of Cleveland, the owner of the Cleveland Browns, sitting members of Congress. The prosecutor who had handled the original case did not oppose the pardon, did not say a word against it. Let that settle. The widow of Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a letter supporting the pardon of a man who had stomped a sick black employee to death over a $600 debt. I'm not going to tell you what to make of that. I'm just going to tell you it happened and ask you to think about what it means about who gets forgiven in America and who doesn't, and why. Sam Garrett's family, as far as any public record shows, was never asked. Not once. In 2018, 35 years after the pardon, Don King is at the Boxing Hall of Fame induction ceremony in Canastota, New York. Mike Tyson is also there. Don walks up behind him and taps him on the shoulder. Friendly gesture. Old colleagues reuniting. Tyson turns around and throws a glass of water in Don's face, on camera, at the Boxing Hall of Fame. Tyson told reporters afterward, "We ain't friends." He talked in there like he was my friend, and that was just bullcrap. He really did me in. That was 20 years after the lawsuit. Tyson had the money. The apology tour was over. The industry had moved on, and he still couldn't be in the same room without it coming back up. That's how deep that wound went. Don King is 94 years old right now. April 2026, he's recovering from a hospitalization last year. He still owns a newspaper in Cleveland. He still, technically, promotes fights. He still gives away 2,000 turkeys every Christmas in South Florida. He still does interviews. He's been a guest at the White House under multiple presidents from both parties. He's been photographed with Barack Obama and Donald Trump. He has been inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. A stretch of street in Cleveland is named after him. And his most famous saying, the one you've heard 1,000 times, is still only in America. And you know what? He's not wrong. Because all of this whole story, from the bombed porch to the Supreme Court case to the $100 million fight in Zaire, to the hospital room with the suitcase to the Senate hearings, to the pardon with Coretta Scott King's signature to the Hall of Fame, induction to the street sign in Cleveland, all of it could only happen in a country where a man can stomp another man to death on a public sidewalk and end up with a Statue of Liberty replica at his estate. That is what Don King meant by only in America, and that is also what the people who paid for it meant, just in a different tone of voice. Okay, I want to end with Sam, because the whole reason I started looking at this case was that I couldn't stop thinking about him. Do you remember what I asked you to hold on to at the beginning of this video? $600. That was the debt. That was what Sam Garrett owed his boss on April 20th, 1966. $600. That's what a man's life was weighed against on a Cleveland sidewalk. 8 years later, Don King produced The Rumble in the Jungle and made $100 million in revenue. Larry Holmes alleges Don stole $10 million from him alone across his career. The Tyson settlement was $14 million. Terry Norris, $7.5 million. Over the course of 50 years in boxing, the total money that flowed through this one man's hands has been estimated at, well, over $1 billion. And it all started with a man on a sidewalk who owed $600. That's the ratio. $600 cost a man his life. $100 million made a man a legend. 48 years, 3 months, and 10 days is how long Sam Garrett got to be alive. 94 years and counting is how long Don King has gotten. That's the asymmetry. That's the whole story. Sam Garrett had 4 kids, according to later reporting. Nobody ever interviewed them for a major story. Nobody wrote a book about them. When the Cleveland City Council proposed naming a stretch of Cedar Avenue Don King Way in 2016, the exact street where Don had stomped Sam to death, the proposal eventually got shelved after public pushback. But the earlier section of Shaker Boulevard named after Don remains in place. You can drive down it today. Sam Garrett does not have a street anywhere in America. He does not have a plaque. He does not have a museum exhibit. He has a gravestone somewhere in Cleveland and a handful of sentences in old court documents. And the phrase, Don, I'll pay you the money, which are the last words we have of him, an apology for owing money he didn't have to a man who was about to make more than any sports promoter in American history, a man who would never be punished, a man who would be pardoned by the widow of Martin Luther King, a man who, at 94 years old, is still walking around South Florida, handing out turkeys at Christmas, and a man who, according to his own words in an on-camera interview decades later, said this about killing Sam Garrett, quote, It was what I call the frustrations of the ghetto expressing themselves. His head hit the ground. Those are the things that happen. Those are the things that happen. Sam Garrett was 34 years old. He was a father. He was somebody's son. He had a last sentence, and it was an apology. And this video is the longest thing anybody has ever written about him. I hope that means something.